northwest of Lincolnshire, and the Isle of Axholme. We've got really two main settlements. That's Crowle and Epworth, and they're sort of bounded by various rivers, which we'll just run through. So I'll break the phases down of the drainage down that we'll talk about. So the pre-Vermouden drainage, sort of Roman and medieval. The 17th century, that's when Cornelius Vermouden performed the significant part of his drainage schemes. Late 18th century into the early 19th century, the 19th century, and through to the 20th century. And arguably, this whole sort of continuum of the drainage history should include what the Environment Agency are planning over the next 10, 20 years as their forecasts go. If we look at the area that the Isle of Axholme's in, was under, during the Ice Age, it was under Lake Humber, which was a glacial lake formed by a blockage known as the Humber Gap. The Humber Gap's approximately where the Humber Bridge is. And as I say, during the Ice Age, we saw several changes in water level, and that actually resulted in most of the historic rivers having incised valleys, which were subsequently filled by peat and other sort of organic material, and they sort of filled up. We know that the area was inhabited by early man. There's a lot of remains. In the Neolithic period, we could sort of see that man began to cultivate the land, and the stone and flint axe heads have been found in Crowle and around the Isle of Axholme. And the axe head I've got there, that's a beautiful axe head from Root, which must be one of the finest examples, which I think is actually on display at the museum now. So there was also a Neolithic wooden trackway, which was found under the peat in Hatfield Moor in 2004. So we've got the Neolithic wooden trackway, which was found in 2004. In fact, a reconstruction of that trackway was made a couple of years ago at Hatfield as part of the Landscape Partnership project. And again, there's further evidence of activity on the Isle of Axholme in the Bronze Age, where metal artefacts have been found at Low Burnham and Kidby, and there's a Bronze Age wooden trackway that was found under the peat at Thornmoor in 1972. So if we look at the rivers, the map here on the right hand side sort of shows the rivers in their original courses before any modifications were made to the rivers. And you can see on the eastern boundary we have the River Trent. To the north we have the River Aire and the River Ouse, which sort of form the northern boundary. The River Idle coming in from the west, which is formed by the confluence of the Mourne and the Meaden. That's one of the rivers that flows through Clumber Park. And then it goes on through Retford and Bawtry before entering the River Trent at Stockwith now, though originally joined the River Don near Sandtoft. We've got the River Don, which rises in the Pennines and runs for about 70 miles through Sheffield and Rotherham, and that originally ran from Thorn to Sandtoft and then into the River Trent near Trent Falls, where the River Trent and the Ouse meet to form the Humber. And that actually forms the county boundary, or the historic county boundary, between Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. Though over time that county boundary has been amended, so that in 1888 I think it was amended to include the peat moors at Crowle, and obviously subsequently now we have a county boundary that doesn't even run down the River Don in its original course. So the first modifications to the rivers we know happened long before the Dutch drainage schemes of the 17th century. We have two modified rivers, and that's the River Idle, which ran along a man-made channel known as Bickersdyke into the River Trent at West Stockwith. And we also have a man-made channel of the River Don travelling north into the River Aire. Note I said River Aire, not the River Ouse, into the River Aire at near Cowick. These we know from geological evidence, and you can also see on LiDAR evidence, are man-made. There's no documentary evidence for when they were constructed. It's likely that Bickersdyke is Roman. Turnbridge Dyke could be Roman, but actually I was talking to Nikki Whitehouse, and her view is that it's more likely to be medieval, in that there's a lack of sort of Roman artifacts have been found on that site. One explanation given by Pat Jones in a paper he had written was that the Bickersdyke and Turnbridge Dyke were both constructed at about AD 71, which was when the Romans were moving from moving from Lincoln to York. And it would have actually been quite logical of them to put in these channels so that they avoided having to go around Trent Falls and the problems of actually going up the River Trent and then down the River Ouse. Because certainly those two man-made rivers would not have been good for drainage. They would have really they sort of run parallel to the contours of the land, and if anything would have helped water come into the area. In fact, this is just one of the evidences that the Turnbridge Dyke, that's the River Don as it flows north into the River Aire at near Cowick, and you can see on the map here. If I just put the pointer on that, you can see this is the River Went, and the River Went now flows into Turnbridge Dyke here. And you can see the original course of the River Went, and it goes through this sort of double loop under, obviously now the M18, and then the River Went originally flowed into the River Aire just north of here. And I mean, clearly a natural river wouldn't have crossed another river at right angles like that. And I always think it's interesting to note, as you drive up the 18, you can actually still feel this sort of going over this pair of double bumps of the former course of the River Went. So from the Roman side, as I say, medieval drainage, again, that was a lot of that. There were a number of different orders set up for drainage, the various commissioners looking after the drainage. You can see the examples here, sort of 1327, the number of people constituted as commissioners to view and repair the banks of the River Trent and Don within the 100 of Crowle. Crowle was managed, or was the lord of the manor was the abbots of Selby. And in fact, the abbot of Selby seemed very keen on maintaining, as I say, you can see in 1400 he was instructed by the king to maintain and upkeep the dikes and drainage to ensure the River Don was dug to a breadth of 16 feet and 1 grain of barley, and that the river was not obstructed by bridges weirs. Now, I think the fact that he was actually being instructed to maintain and keep the river open already shows that because of that new course of the River Don flowing north into the River Aire, that the former course of the River Don was already starting to lose flow and therefore actually starting to clog up. It's also likely that the abbot of Selby was responsible for building the Mere Dyke. I have a suspicion that he was trying to divert the revenues that were being made at Adlingfleet on tolls and revenue from material crossing, travelling up the River Don, and that he was looking for an alternative route. Adlingfleet in medieval times was was the third richest living in the country. It was making money from people crossing the Trent and the Don, and obviously material being carried up the rivers. Now, onto the first of the maps of the area, and this was a map, the Inklesmore map, which is from the 15th century. It's a beautiful map. It's in the National Archives at Kew, and the colours are absolutely stunning for a map that old. It's sometimes described as a tabletop map because it can be sort of viewed from all sides of the map. You'll notice that some of the legend can be read from different sides of the map. This shows, if we look at this, this shows the area, so that you can see we've got the River Trent flowing up the east side. We've got the River Humber here. This is the former course of the River Don on the map. This is the River Ouse, and we've got the River Aire shown coming down here. And in the middle, this is really Thorne and Crowle Moors. And the map was drawn because there were disputes between the landowners on the north side of the map, strictly not in the Isle of Axholme, there in marshlands, so we're along the River Ouse there. And this was all about land ownership right and access right to the peat moors. But it's a beautiful map, and there's a few evidence of drainage. This shows the former course of the River Don, or the River Don flowing through Easttoft. It's also the deserted medieval village of Holdenby is shown on the map, actually looking quite scruffy by then, so perhaps it's not surprising it was became deserted. Easttoft shows the bridge across the River Don. If you know Easttoft, the River Don used to flow through the middle of the village there, sort of between the two sides of the village. One side, of course, known as Yorkshire side, and the other side, the High Street, was on the Lincolnshire side. As you can see, this is showing the bridge across the River Don at Fockerby. It doesn't actually show the Lincolnshire side of there, but you can see the other villages along sort of Whitgift, Ousefleet, along the site of the Ouse. And so I've got to include the picture. This is the little picture depicting Crowle in the 15th century. You can see the church tower and the various houses there. It doesn't actually look as smart as Easttoft. Easttoft looks as though it's a lot tidier, but the relevance to the drainage, I could talk about this map all day, so I'll be away. Relevant to drainage, you can see that on this into the River Ouse, that they've actually got a channel here, and they're showing a sort of sluice, sort of maintaining the level of water in there. They were obviously using both trackways and boats to take peat off the moors there. As I say, the map actually goes as far over as this is Turnbridge, sorry. This is the bridge across the River Don as it comes up to the River Aire. So south, as at the top of the picture here, this is the River Aire, and so this is the Turnbridge dyke with the Turnbridge, and that's near, as I say, Cowick. That's obviously a depiction of the earlier bridge before the current bridge, which is still there, although the drain it crosses doesn't have much water in it. And that's the River Aire at Ferrybridge. So that shows the old bridge across the Aire there. What do we know about as I say, the Isle of Axholme? There's Joan Thirskett did a lot of work about the agriculture on the Isle of Axholme before the drainage schemes, and we know that it was quite a prosperous area. There was a lot of common land that was used, remained dry even in winter, so that they could, Epworth and West Woodside kept 12,000 cattle over winter. Crowle had 400 acres of good dry pasture, and they made money actually renting that pasture to other villages for overwintering their animals. Crowle was also important for fishing. It had 33 fisheries, and as you can see, they were sort of valued at £300 a year in 1650. It was, I believe, the town in Lincolnshire, according to the Domesday Book, it had the largest number of fisheries of anywhere in Lincolnshire. So it's not surprising that when the drainage was proposed by Charles I, it was opposed. And I think the sort of summary by Joan Thirsk was that Vermeuden's drainage didn't actually create an agricultural economy where none existed, but it just substituted an arable economy instead of that pastoral economy. And I mean, historically, a lot of these peat moorlands are just described as wastes if they had no value, but they may have had no value to the lord of the manor. It was actually the value to the people in that area. As I say, we can see the various types of produce that was grown in the area, and we know that at the time of the drainage, the sort of hemp and flax was important. The sack and canvas industry and sort of rope making was important. So let me just jump off. We jump onto a map, the sort of second map chronologically, which is the 1596 map. There's again, there's a hard copy here. On the right-hand side, you can sort of see that we don't actually have the top half of the map, but this map shows the south of the Isle of Axholme, so that we're actually looking at Ouston Ferry, sort of down here. So Ouston Ferry, sorry, here. And this map was drawn, and it was all about ownership rights of the land between, or sort of the land between Ouston Ferry and Misterton, because the Nottinghamshire residents were coming across the River Idle, and they were using that land there for grazing their cattle. So a lot of dispute about exactly where the boundary between Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire should be. But here on the map, there's a bit of detail of some of the pre-Vermeuden sort of drainage, and this shows the snow sewer, which originally had 3 separate outlets. You can see this is actually, the top one's called the snow sewer. You then have the Queen's new sewer and the Queen's old sewer. So all describing clearly man-made drainage channels. The snow sewer comes out not far from the Ouston Ferry pumping station, but the Ouston Ferry pumping station doesn't actually operate on the snow sewer. It's actually operating on the drain behind that. It was built much later. This map also shows the original, as I say, the course of the River Idle and the junction at what's now known as Idlestop, with the river flowing north, but also showing the Bickersdyke as it flows to West Stopworth. And at the other end of the map, sorry, just for clarity, this is just showing the Bickersdyke flowing into the River Trent at West Stopworth, and you can see obviously quite a prosperous town, and we're seeing a bit of Misterton there, and a bridge across approximately where Misterton Sauce is now found. We'll talk about that later. Now, as a result of both the sort of the dissolution of the monasteries, so the abbot of Selby lost his lands, and they all reverted to the crown. The Isle of Axholme manor, that reverted to the crown, and so in fact the crown owned large areas of Hatfield, of the land in Hatfield Chase, and James I was the first king to identify that there might be some opportunity for improvement, as they would describe the drainage of the land, and he actually approached the landowners in the area for a report on what they thought the potential was there. They reported back to him in 1622 that they didn't believe it was possible to drain the area or improve it, and he might as well go and look at something else to do. But he wasn't put off by that, and in 1624 he actually asked Cornelius Vermeuden to examine that matter. And however, before Vermeuden was able to sort of be contracted to take that on, King James I died. So of course it really then fell to Charles I. There is a story that actually Vermeuden first met Charles I when he was prince on Thorn Mere, and this is a picture of hunting on Thorn Mere. Thorn Mere was a large a sort of open lake mere between Thorn between Thorn and Sandtoft in the levels. And here you can see they've driven deer into the mere, and they're hunting them from boats in the mere, which seems a bit unfair on the deer. By 1626, on the 24th of May, Charles I had an agreement with Cornelis Vermuyden. So I used Vermuyden. I asked some of my Dutch colleagues how to pronounce his name, and they insist on Vermuyden. I think the English vernacular tends to be Vermuyden or Vermuyden, but as having got Vermuyden, I'll tend to use Vermuyden. So the contract that he wrote, that was drawn up, concerned the lands at Hatfield Chase in Dyke Marsh, which is the north of Thorn, the manors of Root, Finningley, the Isle of Axholme, and various other lands. And the objective was to make fit for tillage and pasture, and originally to forever maintain fit for tillage and pasture. And in return, Vermuyden was to receive a third of the land. A third of the land remained with the Crown, and then a third of the land went back to the commoners. And on completion of the works, a corporation was to be formed to ensure the maintenance of the land. So it does seem a bit unfair, I suppose, if you were a commoner and you had the common access to that land and you lost 2/3 of it. Who was Cornelis Vermuyden? Well, he was obviously born in the Netherlands in St. Martensdijk, 1595. Again, it wasn't as if he came to the Isle of Axholme from nowhere. He'd actually already spent a lot of time in London, and he was involved in drainage works or repair works on the seawall at Dagenham, the Dagenham Breach as it was called, and Canvey Island was also one of his jobs. So in fact, actually, Canvey Island is one of the other towns in the country where they actually have a Vermuyden secondary school. Where, as I say, because he was responsible for reclaiming Canvey Island. He had various rules about draining, and really and this is part of the explanation for why you have more than one big channel for the drainage, is that in his general rule of draining, you would embank the rivers. So any rivers with obviously water flowing down them, you would embank them so that they don't flood into the land that you're draining. But then you need another drain, a second drain, to lead away the water that from the rainfall that falls on the land. Because you can imagine that the rivers are always going to be tend to be carrying more water than that. And obviously, all of the drainage that was done originally was done using gravity drainage. There was no pumping, so that at low tide they would open the gates, let the water out, high tide close the gates to stop the water coming back. And I mentioned the third part of his rule of draining was that there should be maintained receptacles of land for sudden downfalls of water, recognising that you need somewhere for large volumes of water to go when it floods. And I suppose jumping to a sort of conclusion on where he might have made mistakes in that's the one thing that really there isn't much included in the drainage of the Isle of Axholme, this sort of receptacles for sudden downfalls of water. If you look at the drainage in Cambridgeshire, where he went on to after the Isle of Axholme, you have large areas that are allowed to flood in winter between the Bedford rivers. And so that when there's a lot of water, and you can't necessarily let that water out at low tide because of high tides and other things, you actually had a lot of opportunities to store that water. But what was the work he did? Let's talk about this. So between 1626 and 1628, the first phase of his drainage was referred to as the drainage of Hatfield Chase. What he did was he put a stop in at the bottom here so that the River Idle would no longer travel north as well as travelling eastwards, and that was known as Idle Stop. and that forced all of the River Idle to flow out into the River Trent at West Stopworth. He put another stop into the River Don at Thorn, and that then stopped the River Don flowing eastwards and forced it to all flow northwards up into the River Aire. And his original plan was just to flow straight up into the River Aire near Cowick. He built various barrier banks because obviously, in addition to blocking off the rivers, you want to make sure it won't flood the land you're draining. So he built the barrier bank at the Ashfield Barrier Bank, which sort of prevented the River Don encroaching on the area. He also built a barrier bank on the east side of the River Don known as Dykesmarsh Bank. He built a navigable sluice through the barrier bank at Ashfield, the Thorn. And he built a barrier bank along the north side of the River Idle. And so that then he drove sort of what was known as a new Idle drain northwards from Idlestock all the way up to Dirtness. And from Dirtness, he then drove a pair of drains so that then drained into the River Trent at Althorpe. And the final river, we'll come back to the final river, the River Torn, as there's some interesting routes given on one of the early maps of the drainage. And for those who don't know the area, this is a picture of Idle Bank. So this is the road as it runs from Idlestock all the way up to Dirtness. It's a distance of about 7 or 8 miles. So this is looking south from Tunnel Pits, and the new Idle actually ran up the other side of the road here, and this is looking north from the Tunnel Pits towards Dirtness, and the new Idle originally ran up here. Now Tunnel Pits, as I say, subsequently that's where the River Torn passed under the River Idle through a tunnel, hence Tunnel Pits. This is showing one of the two drains that headed out towards Althorpe. As I say, there were originally a pair of drains driven from Dirtness to Althorpe. They're no longer discharged at Althorpe, as we'll see in later. But this sort of gives an idea of the sort of drain. And this is looking from Pilfrey Bridge. And as I say, one of those drains was really carrying the River Torn. And the other was really carrying the drain, the water that was falling on the land. A lot of the drains and so on will have been subsequently dug out and I always think changed. I always feel the Ashfield Bank, which is the barrier bank that was built around to the west of Thorn to stop the Don reflooding the area, is probably one of the least changed items of sort of work in the area. And it does have a feel of a very old structure, and so there's a footpath you can walk from Thorn to Stainforth if you start at Thorn Lock and walk along the top of the bank, and it does have the feel of an old bank and a lot of history. So that was his first phase of work. His second phase of the work was with the drainage of the south of the Isle of Axholme. And this involved building the Munkham drain and the snow sewer. He actually filled in 2 of those 3. In that previous map, we saw 3 sewers coming out into the River Trent, and he filled in 2 of those so that all of the discharge was out of the one leg there. He also arguably jumped the gun a bit in that they set up the Commission of Sewers in 1629, so before he'd completely finished, because that would empower them to actually start allocating the land, and he would actually start being able to make some money from this. As I say, we'll just jump onto the River Torn. Mentioned the River Torn. I think the accepted wisdom, it was you know, it was all part of his original scheme, was that the River Taun would go through this tortuous tunnel under the new River Idle, and then pass along much of on its current route, past Hurst Priory and into his rivers at Hurst Priory before flowing into the River Dalthorpe. But when you look at the 1633 map, there are two maps drawn in 1633 of the drainage. There's some annotations on this map. And so this is the 1633 map. This sort of shows, as it says on the caption there, the drainage of the land in Hatfield Chase and the levels in the county of York, Lincoln and Nottinghamshire. And there's an annotation on the map that says that the River Old Taun follows eastwards as this triangle map. And of course, the map north is to the left-hand side of the map in this case, and it follows a triangular mark, and that follows round through route, and then formally came into the former course of the River Idle at what's marked on the map as Ben Intake. Yeah, I can follow that as the original course of the River Taun before it was redirected. But this 1633 map has an annotation that says, and the new Taun begins and follows this Z symbol and flows into the River Idle near Sandtoft. And we sort of think, that's odd, that's not where it goes now. And this is actually the route that the River Idle is shown on the 1633 map, flowing round Hatfield Moors, and I suspect making use of medieval drains around the moors. How the River Taun would survive flowing round, you know, this tortuous route round Hatfield Moors, I really don't know. It's perhaps not surprising that at some subsequent date the River Taun took its current route or its prior route, which actually followed what we now know as the Folly Drain. It actually followed the route of the Folly Drain. As you'll see by the Victorian work later, it was only then that those drains were straightened up. Now, that was the planned work, but actually Vermuyden actually had a lot of subsequent work that he had to do. There were navigable sluices, as I say, we already mentioned the navigable sluice at Thorn, but there was also one at Miston Soss, and there was also one into the River Aire at Cowick, at Turnbridge. But because of severe flooding in Sykehouse and Fish Lake, and the argument being, well, he's put this new barrier bank down the east side of the river, the course of the River Don there, it's actually causing it to flood onto the west side of Fish Lake and Sykehouse, and because we know Fish Lake for flooding in recent years, they were saying, well, it's all been caused by this new barrier bank you've built the far side. But there was an investigation, and they found that actually the barrier bank on the west side of the River Don, the Turnbridge Dyke there, wasn't particularly well maintained, and it was, I think, described as having straw and hay shoved in holes, and therefore they actually agreed that if the inhabitants of Fish Lake and Sykehouse paid Vermuyden £200, he would properly repair their ancient riverbanks. But they still continued with flooding. It didn't sort the flooding out. Fish Lake and Sykehouse continued to flood. And it was then that in 1630 there was this Wentworth judgment where Lord Wentworth compelled Vermuyden and his participants to build the Dutch River, which was an additional drain which went from the north end of the Turnbridge Dyke, and it flowed into the River Ouse at where Goole is now. Goole didn't exist there. Hook existed, but not Goole. And it was originally constructed as two drains, but in 1651 there was a big storm, and apparently the water flow was such that it actually washed the bank out between the two drains, and that became one large straight drain, much as we know it now. Navigation, apparently, they didn't actually use that for navigation. Navigation continued to go through the lock into the River Aire at the top end at Turnbridge. So as I mentioned, the various locks. Those 1633 plans also, actually have the dimensions of the locks, so that we know that the Turnbridge lock was 18 foot by 60 foot, so quite a large lock there. And Thorn, we had a 16 foot by 50 foot, which was similar to the one at Misterton or Stockworth, as it says on that map. Now, we'll jump onto the 1639 map. This is the Isle of Bute map. So most of the histories of the drainage of the Isle of Axholme use the Isle of Bute map of one form or another to show the drainage of the area. Really, this map was actually drawn for show how the land was split up. Again, it's another beautiful map. This is at Nottingham University's manuscript collection. As I say, this sort of shows the participants, the people who actually helped fund the drainage, who worked with Cornelius Vermouden, and it shows how the land was separated between the different participants. So you can see that each of the plots of land has a different letter against it, and each letter applies to a different person. And again, you see this map doesn't show the route of the River Torn as it sort of currently flows here either. Interesting, this shows this lake here just north of Kroll, north on this map is to the right hand side of the map, and that's known as Blackwater, that large bank there. Now, I'm using this map to talk about the locks that we mentioned, the three locks, the SAS as they were marked. The SAS is actually the Dutch term for a lock of this type. But if you look at that picture there, you might say, well, that doesn't look like any lock I've ever seen. Locks have mitre gates that meet in the middle, and how does that, sort of look like a lock? And in fact, I can see that when the copies of this map, and this is the copy of the Isle of Bute map in Reed's history, the lithographer who's actually copied this map has actually drawn it, and it looks like a watermill, because he obviously couldn't recognise this as being anything, and he's obviously got wheels on it, so he obviously thought it must be a watermill. So it's drawn as a watermill, which is a good example of why it's always, copies of copies, become, a bit of Chinese whispers. But this is a picture here of an early Dutch pound lock, a modern reproduction in a Dutch park. And as you can sort of see, that they were not mitre gates, they were just guillotine gates that were lifted by these big wheels at the top. And so you can sort of almost now understand the picture. Interestingly, the word SAS is very similar to the word sash for sash windows, and apparently comes from the same root. And sash windows, I understand, were actually introduced. It was sort of introduced about the same time by the Dutch. So that that sort of maybe that sash, it all links it together. But that sort of shows. This shows the Isle of Bute's map. This shows the lock into the River Aire, and this also then shows the lock on the River Idle, or the Bickersdyke, just before it goes into West Stockworth. The other thing that worth mentioning in the drainage is the boating dyke, not to be confused with the canals that were built in the late 19th century to extract peat off Thorn Moor to Moor Ends. But there were man-made drain, the boating dyke, which actually flowed from the south side of Thorn Moors and into the river. Into the river at Thorn, and as I say, the boating dyke, as the name implies, was where they would take the boats with the peat on and out to load it on for transshipment. The peat cutting was normally done in the summer, so that they would cut the peat in the dry, they would then stack it to dry, and then in winter, when there was enough water in the drain, in the boating dike, to take the peat out, they would then load the boats up with the peat, take that to Thorn Waterside, and boats would then sort of transship that up to Hull and quite large distances away, Hull, York and elsewhere. But the boating dike became, at the beginning of the 19th century, when they built the canal, the Stainforth and Kidby Canal, that actually cut the boating dike at Three Rivers, or Three Bridges, at the near the lifting bridge at the east end of Thorn. And in 1817, they had a bit of an investigation to find out why people weren't using it anymore. But it's some quite nice descriptions about, from the different people who used to operate boats, about how they work with their families and so on. I'm really skipping over the 17th and 18th century because there's very little in terms of the actual engineering side of the drainage that happened. Obviously, there was a lot of argument about the land ownership, centering on the Mowbray Award, and that actually resulted in, during the Civil War, the local populace destroying the sluices at Snow Sewer. That meant the whole of the south of the Isle of Axholme was flooded, and it wasn't until 1645 that there were orders to restore the drainage at the south end. As I say, again, after that, there was little done to improve the drainage. Mainly, it was all about maintenance and the records, because this Hatfield Chase Corporation was set up, this Commissions of Sewers was set up. The records are actually quite good. They're all in the Nottingham University Library, and you can actually sort of see, the records of what work was done each year. But the trouble is, clearly the drainage wasn't working as well as it could, and as I say, 1763, River Idle and Thorn broke their banks. And so this is about when they started bringing a number of the sort of eminent Victorian engineers for their views. So John Smeaton, he's regarded as the founder of civil engineering. And as you can sort of see there on that brief description of him, he was a bit of a polymath that had worked on lighthouses, canal building, but also harbours and fen drainage. He'd originally been working in the area at Potterick Car, just to the west of Doncaster, and he'd also worked on the Addenfleet drainage back to the north, or between the Isle of Axholme and the River Ouse, where he'd actually put in quite a lot of drainage there, 29 kilometres of drain, and he was asked for his opinion on what should happen to improve the drainage in the Isle of Axholme. He recommended sort of additional sluices and weirs to be put in, and also recommended the deepening of the ferry sluice and the deepening of the drain to Althorpe, and that seems to have been a continued story. As there was no pumping engines, and the only way of the water was allowed to flow out would be to allow it by gravity at low tide. Everyone seems to sort of recommend that you dig the drains deeper and you can get more to flow out. Other people came in, Thomas Tofield, Thomas Yeoman, as a Smeaton had further ideas. Thomas Tofield, his report, I don't think any of his report actually was taken up, but he recommended diverting the River Torn into the Don. So instead of the River Torn flowing across the middle of the Isle of Axholme, it would have actually flown sort of northwestwards into the River Don at Thorn. Unfortunately, never moved on with that idea, but it might have been quite successful in sorting out the drainage in the Isle of Axholme. Smeaton, his report in 1776, and you'll see some maps related to that, he recommended a new outfall near Waterton, and one of the reasons for using Waterton was the the River Trent there is much wider, and therefore the sort of high tide won't be as high. There was some of his reports were taken up, and they put in additional drains, and we'll see that. So this is
just 5 minutes.
5 minutes. So this shows the recommendations from Smeaton, and this is at the bottom here is showing the realignment of the River Torn and also taking the new drain in there. So this is actually showing the course of the River Torn before it was straightened, and that is the course of the, as what we would now know, refer to the folly drain. And he was then proposing the straightening of the River Torn. So that's when you're in Belton, you go along the road towards Sandtoft and Belton. You actually cross two wide straight drains, and they're the Smeaton's realignment of the River Torn. And there the map just showing, recommending, when he was recommending to take the drain from the river across to near Waterton, further down the Trent, because that would have given it more head to sort of get rid of the water. And this is, as I say, again, the map just showing the former course of the River Torn, and as you can see, flowing into the rivers at rivers at Millhurst Priory, and you can see in pencil the straight lines have been drawn on, showing where the new drain should go in. And I always like to think that the pencil would have been drawn by Smeaton himself, but he probably had someone working for him. Anyway, the 1801, that's just showing the drain in, and you can see that this is the what's shown as the aisle drain, and this is the what became known as the folly drain, as it didn't really work as well. So that's showing the straightened River Torn. So this is Smeaton's realignment. This is 18th century work. Further drainage because of enclosures which allowed for warping. Jump over that. Kroll enclosures. Again, they were they're allowing warping to improve the land, and then various works. John Rennie, again, eminent engineer, and this is actually showing one of the aqueducts for one of the new drains at the beginning of the 19th century, which actually took the waters of the New Idle under the River Torn. This is at Pilfrey Bridge, and it's still there. There's one of about 3 siphons in the area. This is the siphon at Sandtoft. That's the New Idle passing under what is now the Hatfield Waste Drain. That's the other view of that. And there's another drain just near the Scunthorpe roundabout, the Kroll roundabout, the Kroll gyratory system. And this is showing the sluices into the River Trent at Althorpe. And in fact, you can still see remains of that sluice if you peer over the wall there. So early 19th century, they're still getting floods, still concerns. And the biggest problem was that because they could only allow the water to flow out at low tide, if there was a lot of flood water, as there was in 1828, there were 5 weeks where they couldn't actually allow any water out from the River Trent, into the River Trent from the Isle of Axholme. And of course, that just meant the water just backed up. And of course, a lot of low land was flooded and the crops were lost. So they set up a committee to discuss how they might do it. And the first idea, which actually the Act of Parliament was passed, was an 1830 Act, which would have seen a long drain going all the way up to near where the River Don originally flowed into the River Trent. But there was a lot of opposition, mainly because the people whose land it was going to consume weren't going to benefit from the drainage, and it was going to be very expensive. So in 1830, they actually appointed an engineer, George Leather, and he produced a number of reports. And he actually starts one report by saying, I know you want me to recommend putting a pumping station in. And if you do put a pumping station, he said, I think you can sort out the drainage without putting a pumping station in. But if you do, you want to put it in the south of the Isle. So I'll jump over that. But what do? They build one in the north of the Isle of Axholme, near Hurst Priory, which they then subsequently moved. Without going through all of these, this just shows the pumping engines when they were first introduced. The 1828 pumping engine on the mother drain technically isn't in the Isle of Axholme because it's south of the River Idle and on the mother drain, but that was sort of like the first main pumping station in the area. All these early pumping stations were scoop wheel type pumping, which is just like a reverse water wheel, so you can see the sort of limited height to which they can raise the water. These are the two pumping stations on the mother drain at Misterton Soss, and the original pumping station was here. That was the 1828, and if I remember, I should remember the names of the two pump stations. One's called Ida, and the other's another one. And this was built about 1835, just a little later. And this is the biggest dike, and you can just see the sluices beside the Misterton Soss, the lock at Misterton. Now, the Hurst Priory engine was put in 1831. This is the looking for a contract of it. When it was put in, it was actually a second-hand pumping engine, or second-hand engine, should I say. It was originally a marine engine that was put in there with a 30-foot diameter scoop wheel. And you sort of say, well, there's no pumping station near Hurst Priory. Well, just opposite the entrance to Hurst Priory, there's a nursery, and that was where the pumping station was. This plan actually comes from when the land was sold back to the owners of Hurst Priory because they no longer needed it because the pumping station had been moved. There's also records of the wonderful record of the engine account book. I'm going to have to jump on.
Right, we need to stop now.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry, I've run out, so I haven't even got to the 20th century. Do apologise.
Right. So sorry we haven't managed to get to the end, but has anyone got any questions? Yeah.
I'm sure everybody can hear me.
We are recording, so.
Okay, right, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
The question I wanted to ask was about the walking drain.
Yes.
Does that come into this? There's one that I know, sort of, which is north of Idle Stop.
Yes.
I don't know much about
I think that was the warping drain for the process. It was really 19th century that warping was the process. Historically, you had natural warping. When a river floods, obviously it's full of sediment and so on, and that would allow that to settle on land. And that's one of the reasons why the Isle of Axholme was a very productive agricultural, even before the drainage, because of the sediment that the rivers would deposit in winter. So the warping drains were constructed so that the river would be allowed to flood areas of land, and then you could build that land up with the sediment from the warp. And quite often that was associated with peat extraction. So if you look at the west side of Thorn Moor, you have Making Durham's warping drain, and that was used to improve the peat land there. Once they'd taken the peat out, they could then build up using this natural warp in the river. But you have Swinefleet warping drain, which actually was used to warp a lot of the area around Easttoft and Luddington, and as you say, in the south of the Isle. I think when people refer to the warping drain, that's actually snow sewer, if I'm correct. You've got snow sewer because that's where I mentioned that the drain that the South Street, the pumping station Houston Ferry actually operates on isn't the snow sewer, it's the drain behind it. And I think that was like the return drain for the warping process.
When were they built? The one?
Oh, mainly early 19th century, early 1800 and so, because they tended to be, and certainly the Isle of Axholme, Epworth, when they did the enclosures, quite often the Enclosure Acts permitted them to warp the land as well, so that they could improve the land using warping. So it's all early 19th century of the warping.
The area that I'm thinking of is called Park Drain. You know why it's called that?
No, I know the one. I know the one. Yes, that is. That, as I say, I was thinking that's up where, because going sort of on the west side of there. No, I don't know which park it's for, because that was where they were going to build the colliery just near there. But
Yeah, thank you.
I'll go up another half hour on that.
The Park Drain area was the sort of where the start of the was going to be digging the mine, wasn't it?
Yes. Because that was.
So the locals in there call that Klondike.
Yes, that's right.
Park Drain area called it Klondike.
Because that's what the Park Drain Hotel was meant to be the first building in the village they were building there.
Yeah.
Yes.
You got the pub first.
Yes. Yes. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Interest anybody without working agriculture all over the art.
Yeah.
And when you walk, you know, down the field,
Yeah.
you can see the track of most of the old rivers where they cross the road. Soils are completely different.
Yeah.
There's strong strips really right through the river. If you follow that idle drain, that whole straight.
Yes.
It crosses the road in one place, it comes back and crosses it.
Yes.
Through all the different farms, and you can track it right from one end to the other. You know your way around to it. The soils are completely different. So
But,
your land.
that's interesting. I mean, that's interesting to know, because I know that when they put in the pumping station at IoAHC, that was where the Hurst Priory pumping station was moved to. It was all moved by boat from Hurst Priory to IoAHC, and they built. That's right. So it was even third hand by the time it got there, because there's a record in one of the newspaper. Well, in fact, this newspaper report here of a couple of the boats actually carrying some of the masonry from Hurst Priory to IoAHC, or route as they refer to it here. But what part of what they were doing there, they actually dug the warp out of the original course of the river, and then spread that on the land. And so they always talk about there being three types of warping. You've got the natural warping, which is when the rivers just flood by themselves. And one of the maps I've got here shows, the LiDAR map I've got here shows, you can see the natural warping of the river around the river banks. Then you've got the warping using warping drains, and then they have what they call cart warping, when they would carry the warp material from, where it had been collected, either in a field through the warping drains or out of the original river channel. And that was another way. But as you say, that must have been the good material. That was a good place for your agriculture, I guess.
Yeah. No, I operate on the country for a while.
Oh yes.
The Kelfield, which outside of Lincolnshire.
Yes.
They put electric ones in now, they're automatic. The big old ones, one of the others, because it's drain. When you go real heavy rain, you just start putting in so much weed in the drain. You've got a pump for that. The pump will come far faster than the pump flow do it. So you take out, keep stopping for an hour, and it's dreadful.
Yes.
The design, everywhere. I just do it with the weeds in the drain, used to get pulled rapidly down towards the pump, and you'd be really stopping it getting in, and you just stand outside in the rain, all the coal and people, trying to clear the thing to get it to the pump, It was
yeah. I mean,
automatic ones much better, keeps it down to whatever the pump at.
I mean, I still think it's incredible that, the gravity drainage was still important right up to the middle middle of the 20th century. I mean, the big pumps at Kidby weren't put in until I think 1940 or thereabouts, or I think just after the war. And so that's a picture of the outflow at Kidby. Of course, you've got the big pumping station across here now, and but yet that was even then the main outflow from the Isle of Axholme. The Kidby outflow really moved from Althorpe. As I said, the original as constructed of the Mound in the 17th century, the outflows were at Althorpe, and it was really at the end of the so it was during the 19th century that they then started constructing the drains, and you've got the 3 rivers flowing up. And the reason there are 3, didn't get the chance for that, the reason there's 3, you've got the River Torn there, or the mains of that, you've got the water coming off the lowland, but one of the recommendations is that where there was even lower land, and in fact this is the biggest problem in the area, that the lowest land is actually almost the furthest from the river. It's all the land around tunnel pits and down towards Idlesop is actually, in terms of elevation, the lowest land. So of course, if you're trying to drain that through a drain that is actually also taking water off land before it gets to the river is higher, it'll tend to flow back to the lower land, and that was why you needed another drain to work on the lower land, a drain to drain from that land, and then of course you've got the river that you want to keep separate from the land you're draining. And of course that is only the case when you haven't got pumps. Once you've got pumps, you can as long as you've got a big drain that's not going to flood the land on either side, you can pump as much water into it as you like. So, but I mean, there's about, I think the last time I read, there's about, when you look at all the different pumping stations, there's about 40 odd in the area. Some of those on the west side were put in by the Coal Authority because of subsidence from the coal mines. They're either operated by the internal drainage boards or they're operated by the Environment Agency, and then there's a few private ones, if you know where they are.
Thank you very much indeed, Angus. That's been very fascinating. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed that today. Should we give Angus a round of applause for an excellent talk? The next talk is going to be on the 18th of May, and it's going to be about digging up the origins of place names. So if you want to sign up for that, I'll be giving it. So it's my area of expertise. So also, if you haven't seen the website that accompanies the exhibition, do have a look at that. It's axholmeplacenames.com. So that's some interesting things in that. So yeah, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.